Back to another matter later.
I call the Honourable Mike Woodhouse.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to address the 3 or 4 very important issues that have been raised either side of the dinner adjournment. But before I do, can I thank the members of the Finance and Expenditure Committee for their consideration of this bill. Tax bills tend to be reasonably dry things, but the committee has applied itself diligently, I think, to some issues that have been raised both in the committee and also in the committee of the whole. And I'll start with the point that Mr. Robertson has addressed in respect of co-location. And I want to thank the committee specifically for their diligent consideration of this issue, because I think we all understood what was intended. That, well, firstly, co-location is not only about efficiency. Actually, what we will be seeing, and indeed the Inland Revenue Department have the responsibility for the administration of things like the student loan scheme, working for families and child support. So there is a significant overlap with the Ministry of Social Development and their roles and functions. So co-location might have an efficiency in the one office, at least that it occurs now, but it also has the potential to improve the quality of the service that we can provide to the New Zealand taxpayer. But I think the committee was right to look carefully at clause 117 in order to ensure that we had that right balance of ensuring that due diligence should take place, because there is a higher standard of care that is required to maintain the secrecy of people's tax records, but that inadvertent breaches should not give rise to an unnecessary punishment. And I think the committee landed that clause in exactly the right place. But the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. The effectiveness of the amendment that the committee has made will be in the manner in which the Commissioner gives effect to it. And I am confident that she understands and will use her best endeavours to protect the integrity of the tax system, and bearing in mind that the exception only applies to unintentional breaches. No intentional breach will be given the protection of this clause. And it was really, and I think that was understood by the committee, but I think the question was more about the margins, you know, what constitutes reckless or careless, effectively, you know, not really understanding or applying oneself as an IRD employee to that requirement. But I'm confident, having spoken to many IR staff around the country, that they take their secrecy obligations very, very seriously. And I've yet to find anybody that is flippant about that. In fact, if anything, ministers have found Section 81 a very, very strong black box, and rightly so, although I do note that later in the year, as part of the tax program, we will be reviewing the Tax Administration Act. And so this is a nice sort of segue into a broader review, and the questions of the privacy of information is going to be foremost in that. Can I turn now to the issue of electronic signatures? Because, okay, I will. Mr. Nash made a very good point before dinner, and it's been followed up by Messrs. Tabato and Robertson, but in raising the question of whether, I think he asked the question about what would constitute reasonable grounds for the receipt of an electronic signature, but then went on to quote Clause 74. Now, that was inadvertent, I'm sure, but Clause 74 actually works on outbound communication. So I want to touch on both of those things, because at the moment we currently have an arrangement whereby it's deemed to be, a document might be deemed to be sent if it is sent to the last known physical address, even if that person has moved on. And we certainly need to update that, because the whole essence of this is to give effect to a much more modern tax administration system. But I think it would be enough simply to say that if somebody has communicated with Inland Revenue by email, then they are reasonable grounds to presume that the Commissioner can communicate back. In fact, registering with My IR requires an email address to be put on there. Once the identity of the registrant is verified, then communication, I think it would be reasonable grounds to assume that the Commissioner can communicate with the taxpayer by that email address, and even if the email address changes, the same thing would apply to the last known physical address. That would be deemed to be to have been sent. It's clause 73 that deals with the issue that Mr Nash was raising in respect of what would constitute reasonable grounds for the use of electronic signatures, Mr Chairman,
The Honourable Michael Woodhouse.
in the receipt of communications from it. Now, I think the same principle would apply, but the question then becomes one of identity, verification that the communication is from the source that it claims to be, because it's not difficult actually to purport to be someone else in an electronic world. So there is, I think, an allowance for Inland Revenue to place a reasonable reliance on the use of electronic signatures, because there is a discretion, obviously, for a signature not to be accepted if Inland Revenue has reasonable grounds to suppose otherwise. Now, that might be inconsistency of information, having a separate communication from someone who was also purporting to be that taxpayer from a different electronic source. But in the absence of a reasonable grounds test, I would be prevented from actually acting on not accepting the signature, even though they had good grounds to suspect that it wasn't, and that it was a fraudulent source, perhaps changing a bank account, for example, and then asking for a refund to be paid into a different bank account. We've got to be, the Inland Revenue have got to be very diligent in ensuring that they're on top of that. I think reasonable grounds has a well understood nomenclature in legal jurisprudence, so I'm confident that the tests that will be applied will be effective ones. I want to just finish by giving the House, the committee, a brief commentary on an issue that Clayton Cosgrove raised before dinner, and that was in the issue on the update on business transformation, because the essence of taxpayer security, the reliance on electronic signatures, and the things that this bill will give effect to are all predicated on a business transformation project, the like of which I think government has not seen at all. The number was $1.5 billion. It's now down thanks to, well, excellent efforts by the Minister, of course, backed up by Inland Revenue. But actually, the fact that we're not building a bespoke system, I think, has a significant value add. And I'm satisfied that while this is a project, which isn't just about technology, actually, this is about fundamentally changing the way Inland Revenue engages with the many millions of taxpayers around the country. And in that sort of real light bulb moment where we're building our tax system around the needs of the taxpayer, not the other way around. And I think that's a significant opportunity to materially improve the experience of interacting with Inland Revenue. But it's a big project. It's risky. Mention was made by Mr Cosgrove of going all the way back to the 90s and INSIS, NovaPay more recently. But there are successes in government IT projects, the ones you never hear about. Certainly the immigration online system, Vision 2015, has gone extremely well. It's under budget. It was just on time. We don't hear about them, Ms Curran, because they are good news. They are good news. And of course, good news doesn't make the front page of the Don Post, I have to say. Bad news definitely will, and NovaPay is a good example of that. But it's also true to say that NovaPay was a good learning experience, I think, in making sure we don't sign agreements before we know that the vendor is ready to roll. Mr Hipkins would certainly agree with that, I'm sure. But I'm satisfied, actually, that I've seen the whites of the eyes of the IT managers at Inland Revenue. Their blood pressure is normal. I test it every fortnight. And that while we are still some months away from phase one, the GST rollout, I'm confident that the business transformation project and the IT platform that will underpin these changes are well on track for a successful implementation.
Reverend Dr. David